Shadows whisper as a glass of bourbon hides a lethal truth. Welcome to the Silent Clue Works. I am your host, Echo of Silence. Step into Nero Wolfe's dark lounge. Comment where you're tuning in from. Your voice truly matters. The case that brought us the bourbon bottle and all the trouble that came with it started on a Thursday evening in late October, when I was sitting in the office reading the evening paper to Nero Wolfe while he worked his way through a bowl of Fritz's chestnut soup. It was one of those peaceful domestic moments that make a man think civilization might have some merit after all, right up until the doorbell rang, and reminded me that civilization also includes people who think their problems are more important than other people's soup. The bell rang twice, sharp and insistent, and Fritz appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who has been personally insulted by brass and electricity. Wolfe didn't look up from his soup, but his spoon slowed to half speed, which in his language meant he was annoyed, but not yet homicidal. "Archie," he said without raising his eyes, "since you appear to be between paragraphs, perhaps you could determine what emergency requires immediate attention at this unseemly hour." I folded the paper and went to the front door, taking my time because anyone who rings doorbells during dinner deserves to learn patience. Through the one-way glass, I could see a man of about 40, medium height, wearing a dark overcoat that had seen better decades and holding something wrapped in brown paper like it was made of crystal and dynamite. His face had the gray, pinched look of someone who had been carrying bad news around for too long and was finally ready to hand it off to a professional. I opened the door and gave him the standard greeting. He looked at me with eyes that were trying to decide whether I was salvation or just another disappointment, and asked if I was Mr. Nero Wolfe. I told him I was Archie Goodwin, and that Mr. Wolfe was at dinner, which in this house was approximately as sacred as Christmas morning and twice as inviolate. He said his name was Martin Kellner, and that he needed to see Wolfe immediately about a matter involving the Dark Lounge. That got my attention. The Dark Lounge was one of those private clubs that rich men join when they want to drink expensive liquor and complain about their wives without having to worry about newspaper reporters or process servers. It occupied the top 3 floors of a narrow building on East 57th Street, and its membership list read like a roster of everyone in New York who owned more than one yacht. I took Kellner into the office and parked him in the red leather chair where he sat clutching his brown paper package and looking around the room like he was memorizing it for a police report. Then I went back to the dining room where Wolfe was finishing his soup with the methodical precision of a man performing a religious ritual. "A Martin Kellner to see you," I announced. "He mentions the Dark Lounge, and he's carrying something wrapped up like evidence in a murder trial." Wolfe's eyebrows rose exactly 1/16 of an inch, which for him was equivalent to jumping up and shouting. The Dark Lounge had been in the news 6 months earlier when one of its members, a federal judge, had been found dead in his private booth under circumstances that the newspapers had described as suspicious and the police had described as none of your business. The case had been closed quietly, but not before generating enough gossip to keep the social pages busy for weeks. "Very well," Wolfe said, pushing his soup bowl away and dabbing his lips with his napkin. "Since he has been admitted to the house, I suppose I must endure his presence. But if this proves to be another tedious matter of marital infidelity or corporate embezzlement, I shall hold you personally responsible for the interruption." We went back to the office, where Kellner rose from his chair like a man who had been waiting for this moment for years. Wolfe settled behind his desk, arranged his bulk in the custom-made chair, and fixed Kellner with the sort of stare that made strong men reconsider their life choices. "Proceed," he said. Kellner unwrapped his package, revealing a bottle of bourbon that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought whiskey should cost more than most people's rent. The label said Pappy Van Winkle Family Reserve, 23 years old, and the amber liquid inside caught the light like liquid gold. But there was something wrong with it. The seal had been broken, and about 2 inches of bourbon was missing from the top. "This bottle," Kellner said, setting it carefully on Wolfe's desk, was stolen from my private locker at the Dark Lounge 3 nights ago, but that's not why I'm here. The bottle was returned the next morning, but someone had tampered with it. They took some of the original bourbon and replaced it with something else. Something that nearly killed a man. He paused, his hands shaking slightly. Mr. Wolfe, I'm the manager of the Dark Lounge. I've worked there for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Someone used my club, my responsibility, to commit what I can only call attempted murder. The police won't listen because no crime was officially reported, but I know what I saw. I need your help to find out who did this and why before they try again. Wolfe picked up the bottle and held it to the light, studying the liquid inside with the focused attention he usually reserved for rare orchids. Interesting, he murmured. And you believe this adulterated bourbon was intended for a specific victim? Kellner nodded grimly. Judge Harrison Blackwood. He's been a member for 20 years, and someone wanted him dead. I pulled out my notebook and uncapped my pen. The peaceful evening was officially over, and the Dark Lounge was about to get a visit from Nero Wolfe's curiosity, which in my experience was considerably more dangerous than most people's malice. Kellner wet his lips and glanced at the bottle as if it might suddenly confess. Judge Blackwood collapsed Monday night around 11 o'clock in the library. That's what we call the private back room where members keep their premium bottles. He'd poured himself 3 fingers of that bourbon, made some remark about needing fortification for the week ahead, and drained half the glass in one swallow. 30 seconds later, he was on the carpet, his face gray as old newsprint, clutching his chest and making sounds like a broken bellows. He paused, his hands working themselves into knots. We have a physician on retainer, Dr. Marcus Webb, who happened to be dining that evening. He took one look at Blackwood and called for an ambulance, but he also did something else. He smelled the glass. Wolfe's eyebrows rose a fraction. And what did Dr. Webb's nose tell him? That the bourbon had been doctored with something that didn't belong in Kentucky whiskey. He managed to save a few drops in a vial before the ambulance crew arrived. Had it tested privately the next day. Kellner reached into his coat and produced a small envelope. Concentrated nicotine extract, enough to kill a horse if Blackwood had finished the drink. As it was, he spent 2 days in intensive care before his heart rhythm stabilized. I looked up from my notebook. Let me guess. The judge doesn't want to press charges because federal judges who get poisoned in private clubs make front-page news, and front-page news makes confirmation hearings for his colleagues very uncomfortable. Kellner nodded miserably. He's claiming it was a heart episode brought on by stress and rich food. The hospital went along with it because Dr. Webb is on their board and suggested discretion might be preferable to scandal. But I know what I saw, Mr. Wolfe. Someone tried to murder a federal judge in my club, and they used my security system to do it. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, creating that fortress of concentration that meant his mind was already 3 moves ahead of the conversation. You mentioned security. I assume the bourbon was secured in some fashion? Private lockers in the library. Each member who keeps bottles there has his own locked compartment. Judge Blackwood's locker requires 2 keys. His personal key and the master key I keep in my office safe. The lock wasn't forced, which means someone had access to both keys or managed to duplicate them. And you suspect this because? Wolfe's tone suggested he already knew the answer. Kellner shifted uncomfortably. Because this isn't the first incident. 3 weeks ago, a bottle of 30-year-old Macallan belonging to another member, Harrison Voss, disappeared from his locker overnight and reappeared the next evening on a sideboard in the main bar. The seal had been broken, but the bottle appeared untouched. Voss raised hell, but we treated it as a prank or staff error. Now I think it was a rehearsal. I made a note. Someone was practicing their breaking and entering technique, testing the security, timing the access, making sure they could get in and out without being caught. That suggests premeditation and patience, not a crime of passion. Wolfe grunted his agreement. Indeed, It also suggests someone with intimate knowledge of your procedures and schedules, who has access to your office where the master key is kept. Kellner pulled out a folded sheet of club stationery. I've prepared a list of everyone who could have had opportunity, but there are 3 names I've marked because they were all present Monday night and they all have compelling reasons to want Judge Blackwood dead. He handed the paper to Wolfe, who glanced at it and passed it to me. 3 names were circled in red ink. Julian Vane, Kellner began, is a corporate attorney who's lost 4 major cases in Blackwood's court over the past 18 months. He's been increasingly vocal about what he calls Blackwood's bias against business interests. Vane drinks at the club almost every night, always positioning himself where he can watch the judge. He's also deeply in debt from some bad investments and an expensive divorce. Desperate men do desperate things. The second is Elena Corves. She's the widow of real estate developer Thomas Corves, who died in federal prison 2 years ago after Blackwood sentenced him to 15 years for tax evasion and fraud. She joined the club 6 months ago under her maiden name, Marchetti, but everyone knows who she is. She's been systematically cultivating relationships with board members, particularly Blackwood. Very charming, very social, and utterly ruthless according to those who knew her husband. Wolfe's eyes were half closed, filing information. And the third? Arthur Penhaligon. He's 73, one of our oldest members, and he has a 40-year grudge against Blackwood that everyone in legal circles knows about. They were law partners in the 70s until Blackwood stole a case, a client, and Penhaligon's fiancée. The fiancée died in a car accident 20 years ago, but Penhaligon's hatred is still fresh as morning coffee. He's also a trained chemist before he went into law. He'd know exactly how to extract and concentrate nicotine. I finished writing and looked up. 3 suspects with motive, means, and opportunity. A lawyer facing ruin, a widow seeking revenge, and a chemist nursing a decades-old grudge. It's like a textbook case in homicidal motivation. Wolfe opened his eyes and fixed Kellner with a penetrating stare. Mr. Kellner, I will take your case, but I require complete access to your club, its records, and its members. Archie will accompany you there tomorrow morning to examine the premises and interview these 3 individuals. My fee will be $5,000 as a retainer, with an additional $10,000 when the perpetrator is identified. Kellner didn't hesitate. He pulled out his checkbook and wrote the amount with steady hands. Find them, Mr. Wolfe, before they try again and succeed. After he left, carrying his empty brown paper and a receipt for services to be rendered, I locked the front door and returned to the office. Wolfe was staring at the bourbon bottle with the expression of a man who had just been personally insulted by Kentucky whiskey. Archie, he said without looking up, tomorrow you will enter a den of wealthy predators where someone has already demonstrated a willingness to commit murder. Be observant, be careful, and above all, don't drink anything stronger than coffee. I nodded and headed upstairs. The dark lounge was waiting, and I had a feeling the next round of drinks was going to be considerably more dangerous than the last. The dark lounge occupied the top 3 floors of a narrow building on East 57th Street that managed to look both expensive and apologetic about it. The ground floor entrance was marked only by a small brass plate that said nothing, which in Manhattan real estate circles is the equivalent of shouting your net worth from the rooftops. I arrived at 10 o'clock the next morning to find Kellner waiting in a lobby that smelled of lemon oil, old money, the kind of discretion that costs extra. He looked like a man who had spent the night rehearsing explanations for things that couldn't be explained, and his handshake had the desperate firmness of someone trying to convince himself that everything was still under control. The elevator was paneled in mahogany that probably cost more than most people's cars, and it rose with the whispered efficiency of well-oiled money. The 8th floor opened into what they called the reception hall, a room designed to make visitors feel simultaneously impressed and inadequate. Dark wood panels rose to a coffered ceiling, Leather chairs the color of dried blood were arranged in conversational clusters, and oil paintings of stern-faced men who looked like they had invented compound interest stared down from the walls. A few early members were scattered around reading newspapers with the focused attention of people pretending not to eavesdrop on each other's financial disasters. Kellner guided me through a side corridor to his office, a space that managed to be both cramped and meticulously organized. File cabinets lined one wall, a desk dominated most of the available floor space, and in the corner sat a steel safe that looked like it had been designed to survive both nuclear war and tax audits. "The master keys," he said, opening the safe and revealing a ring with perhaps 20 keys, each tagged with a brass plate bearing a member's name. I'm the only one with the combination, except for my assistant manager, Leo Griggs. The safe is checked twice daily by our security service, and the log shows no unauthorized access since last Friday. I examined the key ring without touching it. Each key was individually crafted, probably by the same locksmith who had installed the original mechanisms. What about duplicates? Could someone have borrowed the ring long enough to make copies? Kellner shook his head firmly. The keys never leave this office. When a member needs access to his private locker, I personally accompany him and perform the unlocking. It's part of our service protocol and, more importantly, our security guarantee. Members pay substantial fees specifically for that level of protection. Then we're looking at either a very skilled lockpicker, which takes time and privacy, or someone with inside access. That narrows it down to you, your staff, or possibly a member who found a way to borrow a key during one of those accompanied visits. I pulled out my notebook and uncapped my pen. Let's start with your people. Who works here? What are their schedules, and which ones knew Judge Blackwood personally? The staff roster was small but comprehensive. 3 bartenders who rotated shifts, 2 waiters for the dining room, a chef and sous chef in the kitchen, a cleaning crew that arrived after midnight, and Kellner himself, who worked 6 days a week from 9 in the morning until the club closed at 2. There's one connection that concerns me, Kellner admitted reluctantly. Marcus Tully, our senior bartender, is Julian Vane's second cousin. They're not close. Haven't spoken in years, according to Tully. But the family relationship exists. Tully's worked here 8 years with an exemplary record, but under the circumstances. I made a note to have Saul Panza run background checks on the entire staff, paying particular attention to Tully and any recent financial pressures that might make him susceptible to family influence. Wolfe had taught me that blood relations were like underground streams, invisible on the surface, but capable of carving unexpected canyons when pressure was applied. "Show me the library," I said. We took the elevator to the 9th floor and walked down a hushed corridor to a heavy oak door marked with a discreet brass plate. The library was everything Kellner's description had promised and more. The room was long and narrow, lined on both sides with polished wooden cabinets that rose nearly to the ceiling. Each cabinet was divided into compartments with small brass doors, each bearing an engraved nameplate. Leather armchairs and side tables provided seating areas, and a thick Persian rug turned footsteps into whispered suggestions. The air held the mingled scents of aged wood, fine leather, and the ghosts of expensive liquor. "Private lockers," Kellner explained, his voice automatically dropping to library tones. "Only certain membership levels are permitted to maintain personal collections. Judge Blackwood's locker is there, 3rd cabinet on the left, 2nd row from the top." I walked over and examined the nameplate that read Harrison H. Blackwood in elegant script. The brass door had a high-quality tumbler lock that looked like it meant business. "Show me the access procedure," I requested. Kellner produced a key from his vest pocket and inserted it into the upper keyhole. "This is the member's personal key. Without the master, it accomplishes nothing." He turned it as far as it would go. I heard a soft click, but the door remained locked. Then he selected a longer, flatter key from his ring and inserted it into a second keyhole below the first. "The master key." This normally remains in my safe and never leaves the office except for maintenance purposes. Both keys turned together, and the lock yielded with a precisely engineered whisper. Inside the locker were 2 bottles, a Scottish single malt and a bottle of cognac that looked older than I was. The bourbon we knew by reputation was conspicuously absent. "We removed the Pappy Van Winkle for evidence, naturally," Kellner said. "But everything else remains exactly as it was Monday night. Judge Blackwood never shares his bottles. Ever." I studied the lock mechanism carefully. There were faint scratches around both keyholes, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. The marks were precise, made by someone who understood locks and had the proper tools. "These weren't made by an amateur," I said, running my finger along the barely visible scoring. "But they were definitely made. Someone's been practicing on this lock, probably during the McAllen incident 3 weeks ago." We moved across the room to examine Harrison Voss's locker, which showed similar faint marks around the keyhole. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone had used the earlier theft as a rehearsal, testing their technique and timing before attempting the real crime. "You mentioned no cameras in here," I said. "What about the rest of the club?" "Cameras at the main entrance, the elevator, and in the bar areas," Kellner replied. "The board has consistently refused surveillance in the library, the private dining rooms, and the card rooms. Members consider privacy their most valuable amenity." I made another note. Privacy was a double-edged sword. It protected the innocent, but also sheltered the guilty. "Let's talk to your staff, starting with the bartenders." We found Marcus Tully in the main bar, a compact man in his 40s with the quick, efficient movements of someone who had mixed 10,000 drinks without spilling a drop. His eyes were intelligent and wary, the look of a man who had learned to read people's intentions in their drink orders. When Kellner introduced me as a security consultant reviewing recent incidents, Tully's expression didn't change, but I noticed his hands pause fractionally in their glass-polishing rhythm. "The McAllen business," he said when I brought up the earlier theft. "Strange thing, that. Bottle disappeared on a Tuesday night, showed up Thursday morning on the main bar like someone was making a point. Mr. Voss was furious, claimed someone was playing games with him." Tully's voice was carefully neutral, but there was something underneath, a tension that suggested personal knowledge. "Did you notice anything unusual that night? Anyone acting strangely or asking questions about the library?" Tully hesitated, and I knew we were approaching something important. "Well, there was one thing. Mr. Vane, he'd been drinking more than usual that week. Asking questions about club procedures, how the lockers worked, who had access. Said he was thinking about renting one himself, but he seemed more interested in the security arrangements than the storage space." I felt the first piece of the puzzle click into place. Julian Vane had been conducting reconnaissance, using his family connection to pump Tully for information about the club's security protocols. "Did you tell him anything specific about the key system?" Tully's face went pale. "Just general information. How members needed to be accompanied, how the master key worked. Nothing that wasn't common knowledge among the staff." But his eyes said otherwise. He had told his cousin more than he should have, and now he was realizing the implications. After finishing with Tully, I interviewed the other staff members. But none of them provided additional insights. The cleaning crew had been thoroughly vetted and worked under supervision. The kitchen staff rarely left their domain on the 10th floor. The waiters confirmed seeing all 3 suspects in the club Monday night, but couldn't provide specific timelines for their movements. "Time to meet the principals," I told Kellner. We started with Julian Vane, who was holding court in a corner of the main bar with a Bloody Mary and the Wall Street Journal. He was a lean, sharp-featured man in his early 50s, with the kind of expensive haircut that couldn't quite hide the desperation in his eyes. When Kellner introduced me as a consultant reviewing security procedures, Vane's smile had all the warmth of a tax audit. "Security consultant," he repeated, tasting the words like they were slightly sour. "How modern of the club. I suppose this is about the McAllen incident." Much ado about nothing, if you ask me. Probably some new member who didn't understand the protocols. His tone was dismissive, but his hands were steady on his glass, and his eyes never left my face. This was a man accustomed to being watched and judged. I asked him about Monday night, his movements, his interactions with Judge Blackwood. Vane's account was smooth and practiced, too smooth for complete honesty. He claimed to have arrived around 7, spent the evening in the bar and dining room, and left before 11. He admitted to speaking briefly with Blackwood in the main bar, but denied any extended conversation or any visit to the library. "I don't keep bottles here," he said with a thin smile. "Too much temptation for the staff." Next was Elena Corves, whom we found in the smaller lounge adjacent to the dining room. She was an elegant woman in her late 30s, with dark hair and the kind of understated beauty that suggested both breeding and careful maintenance. She wore a cream-colored silk blouse and black slacks that managed to look both simple and expensive. When she smiled at our introduction, her eyes remained completely cold. "A security review," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of an accent that might have been Italian or might have been carefully cultivated sophistication. "How thorough of you. I do hope this won't interfere with the club's atmosphere of discretion." When I asked about Monday night, her recollection was precise but oddly impersonal, as if she were describing events she had observed rather than participated in. She had arrived at 8, dined alone in the restaurant, then spent some time in the library browsing the club's rare book collection. She claimed no knowledge of the private liquor lockers and expressed polite concern about Judge Blackwood's health. Arthur Penhaligon was exactly where Kellner predicted, in the corner of the smoking room, under a portrait of Admiral Nelson, with a cigar and a snifter of brandy that he held like evidence in a trial. He was a tall, thin man in his 70s with white hair that stuck out at odd angles and pale blue eyes that had seen too much human folly to be surprised by anything. When I introduced myself, he looked me up and down with the clinical interest of an entomologist examining a new species of insect. "Another layer of security," he said, his voice carrying the dry precision of a man who had spent decades choosing words like weapons. "Marvelous. Perhaps next you'll install metal detectors and keep out the really dangerous contraband, like ethics and common sense." When I brought up the McAllen incident, he snorted dismissively. "Anyone fool enough to leave 30-year-old scotch in a club locker deserves whatever happens to it. This place is full of people who mistake price for value." His comments about Judge Blackwood were more revealing. When I mentioned the judge's collapse, Penhaligon's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of what might have been satisfaction. "Harrison always did have a weak constitution," he said carefully. "Too much rich food, too little exercise, too many enemies. A man in his position accumulates stress like lint." It wasn't quite a confession, but it wasn't exactly sympathy either. By the time I finished my interviews, my notebook was full and my head was buzzing with possibilities. All 3 suspects had motive, opportunity, and the intelligence to plan such a crime. But something was missing, some crucial piece that would tie method to motive to opportunity. I called Wolfe from Kellner's office and gave him a complete report. From Tully's family connection to Penhaligon's chemical knowledge to Elena Corves' mysterious composure. "Bring me the assistant manager," Wolfe said when I finished, "and see if you can determine what Mrs. Corves carries in her purse that makes her so protective of it. But be careful, Archie. We are dealing with someone who has already demonstrated a willingness to commit murder. They will not hesitate to escalate if they feel cornered." I found Leo Griggs in the club's basement office, a nervous young man in his 20s who looked like he had been expecting bad news his entire life. When I told him Nero Wolfe wanted to see him, he went pale and started stammering about not being at the club Monday night. "That's exactly why he wants to talk to you," I said. "You're the only one with access to the safe who doesn't need an alibi." He came along quietly, but I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. As we were leaving, I managed to bump into Elena Corvez in the lobby, timing it perfectly as she was retrieving her coat from the check room. Her purse spilled open when we collided, and in the confusion of helping her collect the scattered contents, I palmed a small silver key that didn't match any of the club's locks. By the time we reached the brownstone, I had identified it as a safety deposit box key from the Vandermeer Trust Company, based on the distinctive markings Wolfe had taught me to recognize. The afternoon was drawing to a close, and the first pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to fit together. Someone had used Leo Griggs' carelessness with the safe combination, exploited Marcus Tully's family loyalty, and taken advantage of the club's culture of privacy to commit what should have been the perfect crime. But perfect crimes, as Wolfe often observed, existed only in the imagination of imperfect criminals. The truth was hidden somewhere in the dark lounge, and we were going to find it. Leo Griggs sat in the red leather chair like a man who had just realized that all his small indiscretions were about to become front-page news. Wolfe studied him from behind his desk with the patient attention of a botanist examining a specimen that might or might not be poisonous, while I positioned myself at my own desk with notebook ready and pen poised. The afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of what we were about to uncover. "Mr. Griggs," Wolfe began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "you will now explain to me how someone obtained access to the combination of Mr. Kellner's safe. You will do so with complete honesty, or you will find yourself explaining it to considerably less sympathetic ears." Griggs swallowed hard, his Adam's apple working like a man trying to digest bad news. "I didn't mean for anything to happen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was supposed to be harmless, just a way to make some extra money. I never thought anyone would get hurt." The story emerged in fits and starts, punctuated by long pauses and desperate attempts at self-justification. 3 weeks earlier, Griggs had been approached at a bar near the club by a man calling himself Danny Marsh. Marsh claimed to be a freelance journalist researching security vulnerabilities at exclusive private clubs, willing to pay good money for inside information. He had been charming, persuasive, and most importantly, he had been carrying a wallet full of cash. He said he just wanted to know how the system worked. Griggs explained miserably. How the keys were stored, what the procedures were, who had access. He paid me $500 just for general information. Wolfe's eyebrows rose fractionally. "And you naturally provided this information without considering the potential consequences?" Griggs nodded miserably. He seemed legitimate. He knew things about the club, about the members. He said he was writing an article about security at high-end establishments. When he offered another $1,000 for the actual safe combination, I figured it was just research. He promised me nothing would be stolen, that he just needed to verify his information was accurate. I looked up from my notes. "Describe this Danny Marsh. Age, appearance, mannerisms." Griggs provided details with the mechanical precision of a man who knew he was digging his own grave. Marsh was about 30, medium height, dark hair, well-dressed but not ostentatiously so. He spoke with a slight accent that might have been educated European or carefully cultivated American. Most importantly, he had demonstrated knowledge of the club's layout, its membership, and its routines that suggested either extensive research or inside information. "When did you last see him?" Wolfe asked. Griggs went even paler. "Last Tuesday morning. He called and said the project was complete, that I wouldn't see him again. He seemed different, nervous. He paid me the final installment in cash and told me to forget we'd ever met. When I heard about Judge Blackwood's collapse, I tried calling the number he'd given me, but it was disconnected." After dismissing Griggs with stern instructions to remain available for further questioning, I turned to Wolfe. "So we have a hired hand. Someone paid Danny Marsh to get inside information, practice with the McAllen theft, and then execute the poisoning. Marsh was just the tool, not the mastermind." Wolfe nodded slowly. Indeed, which means one of our 3 suspects hired Mr. Marsh to do their work, providing them with both physical distance from the crime and plausible deniability. The question is which one, and how we prove it. I pulled the silver key from my pocket and placed it on Wolfe's desk. This might help. Vandermeer Trust Company, Box 402. I had Saul make some discreet inquiries. The box is registered to Maria Rossi, which happens to be Elena Corves's mother's maiden name according to the club's membership records. She's accessed it 3 times in the past month, always during business hours, always alone. Wolfe examined the key with interest. The Vandermeer Trust Company caters to clients who value discretion above all else. They do not readily divulge information about their depositors, even to law enforcement. However, they are not immune to certain forms of strategic pressure. The phone rang, interrupting our discussion. It was Saul Panzer, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had just connected several important dots. "I found our Danny Marsh," he reported. "Real name Daniel Marcus Antonelli, age 32, originally from Chicago. He's got a record of small-time cons and identity theft. Nothing violent, but plenty of experience with false credentials and social engineering. More importantly, he bought a one-way ticket to Mexico City last Tuesday, paid cash, used his real name. He's either very confident or very stupid." I relayed the information to Wolfe, who listened with his eyes closed. "Neither confident nor stupid," he said when I finished. "Protected. Someone assured him he would be safe once he left the country. Someone with sufficient resources to make that promise credible. The question is whether he was paid enough to ensure his continued silence, or whether his employers consider him a liability to be eliminated." Wolfe opened his eyes and fixed me with a penetrating stare. "Call Inspector Kramer. Tell him we have information regarding an attempted murder case involving a federal judge, and that we require his assistance in a delicate matter involving financial records and interstate flight to avoid prosecution." I raised my eyebrows. Wolfe rarely involved the police this early in a case. "You want Kramer to actually pursue Marsh?" "No," Wolfe said with a thin smile. "I want Mrs. Corves to believe we might pursue him, and more importantly, that we might gain access to her safety deposit box in the process. The Vandermeer Trust Company is notorious for informing their clients when law enforcement expresses interest in their accounts. Fear of exposure is often more effective than actual exposure." The call to Kramer went about as expected. He was predictably irritated about being drawn into a case involving a federal judge who refused to admit he had been poisoned, a private club that valued discretion over justice, and a consultant who wanted police assistance without providing complete information. "You're asking me to rattle cages without knowing what's inside them," he complained. "Do you have any idea how many regulations that violates?" 7 at minimum, Wolfe replied calmly. "However, I'm not asking you to take official action, merely to make certain inquiries that might reach the appropriate ears through the efficient channels of financial gossip. A few phone calls to the right people, expressing interest in recent cash transactions and safety deposit box activity, should suffice." Kramer was silent for a long moment, then sighed the sigh of a man who knew he was going to regret his next words. "If this backfires, Wolfe, I'm holding you personally responsible for the consequences." The response came faster than even Wolfe had anticipated. At 7:30 that evening, while we were finishing Fritz's excellent roast chicken with herbs, the phone rang. It was Kellner, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Mr. Goodwin, something's happened. Mrs. Tycho Corves just called demanding an emergency meeting with me and the club's senior board members. She's claiming that her privacy has been violated, that someone has been investigating her personal financial affairs without authorization, and that she's considering legal action against the club for breach of confidentiality." I covered the mouthpiece and relayed the message to Wolfe, who smiled with evident satisfaction. "Tell Mr. Kellner that Mrs. Corvey's reaction is both predictable and informative. Invite her to visit us tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. Inform her that we have information regarding the attempt on Judge Blackwood's life that she will want to hear before making any decisions about legal action." Kellner sounded doubtful but agreed to pass along the invitation. After hanging up, I looked at Wolfe with curiosity. "You're gambling that she'll come instead of disappearing like Danny Marsh." "Not a gamble," Wolfe corrected. "Mrs. Corves has invested considerable time and resources in her campaign against Judge Blackwood. She will want to know exactly what we have discovered and whether it threatens her plans. Curiosity and desperation are powerful motivators, and she possesses both in abundance." The evening settled into routine, but I found myself checking the locks on the front door and the windows more carefully than usual. We were dealing with someone who had already demonstrated a willingness to commit murder, and cornered animals were notoriously unpredictable. As I prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were approaching the moment when our careful maneuvering would give way to direct confrontation. Elena Corves would be sitting in that red leather chair tomorrow morning, and one way or another, we would learn whether she was our murderer or simply our most convenient suspect. But first, we had to survive the night. And given the pattern of escalation we had observed, I had a distinct feeling that someone was going to make a move before morning. And when they did, things were going to get considerably more dangerous than they already were. My instincts about the night proved accurate at 20 minutes past 1 in the morning, when the doorbell rang with the urgent, desperate rhythm of someone who had finally realized that running away was no longer an option. I was in my room reading a detective novel that was doing its level best to put me to sleep when the sound cut through the brownstone silence like a knife through silk. 3 short bursts, then a pause, then 3 more, the pattern of someone who understood that middle-of-the-night visitors needed to announce their desperation clearly. I pulled on my robe and went downstairs, checking the one-way glass in the front door. The man on our stoop was hunched against the October cold, shifting his weight from foot to foot and glancing over his shoulder every few seconds like someone expecting pursuit. He was medium height, dark-haired, wearing clothes that had seen better days and carrying himself with the defeated posture of a man who had run out of places to hide. When he looked up at the door, I recognized him from Saul's description. Danny Marsh, who was supposed to be enjoying the climate in Mexico City, but had apparently decided that New York offered better survival prospects. I flipped the intercom switch. "The brownstone is closed for the night," I announced. "If you're selling encyclopedias or salvation, you've got the wrong address and the wrong hour." His voice, when it came through the speaker, was tight with barely controlled panic. "This is Danny Marsh. I need to talk to Nero Wolfe about the dark lounge. I don't have much time, and I think someone's trying to kill me." That earned him immediate promotion to the priority list. I went back to the office, where I found Wolfe sitting at his desk in his yellow pajamas and maroon robe, a book open in front of him, and the bourbon bottle from Kellner still positioned on his blotter like evidence in a trial. He looked up when I entered, unsurprised by either my appearance or the interruption. "That will be Mr. Antonelli," he said calmly. His survival instincts have finally overcome his confidence in his employer's benevolence. I gave him the essentials of the brief conversation, and he closed his book with the deliberate care of a man who knew he wouldn't be returning to it soon. "Admit him, inspect him for weapons, and bring him here. Do not mention our prior knowledge of his activities. Let him present himself as he chooses." I went back to the front door, disengaged the locks, and opened it to reveal Danny Marsh in all his nervous glory. Up close, he looked even worse than he had through the glass. His dark hair was damp with sweat despite the cool night air, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of several sleepless nights spent contemplating mortality and finding the view unsatisfactory. When I frisked him, he submitted with the passive resignation of a man who had already surrendered on more important battlefields. He carried no weapons, just a thin wallet with a few bills and a bus schedule folded into quarters. His hands shook slightly as I guided him to the office, where Wolfe waited behind his desk with the patient attention of a confessor who had heard every possible variation of human folly. Marsh stopped 3 steps inside the door when he saw Wolfe, his face registering the particular combination of awe and terror that Wolfe's presence tends to inspire in guilty men. "Sit," Wolfe instructed, indicating the red leather chair. Marsh sat with the mechanical obedience of someone who had run out of alternatives. "You're late," Wolfe observed. "By my calculation, you should have sought my assistance 48 hours before boarding that plane to Mexico, not after discovering that your employers consider you expendable." Marsh's eyes widened. "How do you know about Mexico?" Wolfe gave him a look that could have frozen bourbon. "We will not waste time on obvious questions. You participated in a conspiracy to commit murder. Your employers arranged for your departure, which suggests they also considered the advantages of your permanent silence. You have now realized that Mexico offers less protection than a federal prison. That is why you are here. The question is what you are prepared to tell me in exchange for continued breathing." The confession came in a rush, as if Marsh had been carrying it around too long and was relieved to finally set it down. It had started 2 months earlier when a woman calling herself Lydia had approached him through an intermediary who specialized in connecting people with flexible ethics to people with complicated problems. She claimed to represent clients who needed a security evaluation of an exclusive private club, and she was prepared to pay handsomely for the right kind of expertise. "She knew everything about me," Marsh said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My background, my methods, my financial situation. She had done her homework. When we met, she was elegant, well-dressed, spoke with a slight accent that might have been Italian. She knew the dark lounge inside and out, knew the staff, the members, the routines. She told me exactly who to approach and what kind of story would work on him. The target had been Leo Griggs, whose financial pressures and access to the safe combination made him the perfect entry point. Marsh had cultivated him carefully, presenting himself as a freelance journalist, researching security vulnerabilities at high-end establishments. The story had worked perfectly, yielding not only the safe combination, but detailed information about the club's procedures and schedules. "The McAllen theft was a test run," Marsh continued. "Lydia wanted to see how the staff reacted, how quickly they noticed, who made noise and who stayed quiet. She watched from the bar that night while I moved the bottle. I saw her reflection in the mirror behind the liquor display. She was taking notes. Once the rehearsal proved successful, Lydia had provided him with a small vial containing what she described as a concentrated extract, already measured for the intended purpose. His job was simply to gain access to Judge Blackwood's private locker and introduce the contents into the bourbon bottle. The timing had been carefully planned for a Monday evening when staff rotations and cleaning schedules provided the optimal window of opportunity. She knew everything about the judge's habits, Marsh said. When he arrived, where he went, what he drank, how much. It was like she'd been studying him for months. I went in during the gap, used the combination to get the master key, opened the locker, did the job. 5 minutes, in and out. When I heard later that he'd collapsed from a heart attack, I knew the plan had worked. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Describe this Lydia more precisely." Marsh closed his eyes, summoning details. About 5'6", slim build, dark brown hair, usually in a twist. Always wore gloves, claimed she had a skin condition. Expensive clothes, but nothing flashy. She spoke like someone who'd been educated overseas, but she knew New York too well to be a tourist, and she hated Judge Blackwood with a passion that went beyond professional disagreement. When she talked about him, her whole demeanor changed. After providing the final payment and arranging his departure, Lydia had assured him that keeping quiet would ensure his continued safety. But yesterday, someone had broken into his hotel room while he was out getting food. Nothing had been stolen, but his belongings had been carefully searched and rearranged. His passport had been moved from an inner pocket to an outer compartment, a clear message that his movements were being monitored. "I realized then that I was a loose end," Marsh said, his voice cracking. "Once I was out of the country, an accident could happen. Car crash, mugging, wrong place at the wrong time. I remembered your name from some old newspaper stories. I figured if anyone could keep me alive long enough to testify, it would be you." Wolfe regarded him with clinical interest. "Your assessment is partially correct. However, I'm not a sanctuary. I'm an instrument of justice. Your continued existence serves my purposes, which may coincidentally serve yours." He turned to me. "Call Inspector Kramer. Inform him that a material witness in an attempted murder case involving a federal judge is currently in our office, and that prompt action would be advisable if he wishes to secure that witness in breathing condition." As I reached for the phone, I noticed something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The bourbon bottle on Wolfe's desk had moved. When Kellner had left it there the previous evening, it had been centered on the blotter with the label facing toward Wolfe's chair. Now it sat 2 inches to the left, rotated so the label faced the door. In Wolfe's meticulously ordered world, nothing moved without authorization, and neither Marsh nor I had been near the desk. When I mentioned it quietly after getting Kramer started in our direction, Wolfe extended one finger and pointed to a faint, oily smear on the bottle's neck. "That mark was not present when I retired," he said softly. "Someone has been in this office tonight, Archie. They have left us either a warning or an invitation. Given recent events, I suspect both interpretations may prove accurate." The game was entering its final phase, and our opponent had just announced their presence in the most personal way possible. The Dark Lounge's secrets were coming home to roost, and the brownstone itself had become the battlefield where they would be settled. The immediate aftermath of discovering our midnight visitor required methodical investigation despite the late hour. I conducted a complete sweep of the brownstone while Wolfe examined the bourbon bottle with his magnifying glass, searching for additional evidence our intruder might have left behind. The kitchen revealed the most telling clues. Faint scratches around the side window lock mechanism, identical to those I'd observed at the Dark Lounge. Someone with professional lock-picking skills had entered through that window, moved through the house with remarkable stealth, and departed the same way after leaving their calling card in the office. Wolfe's analysis of the bottle yielded additional information. The oily smear on the neck contained traces of what appeared to be theatrical grease paint, the kind used by actors to create realistic aging effects or alter facial features. "Our visitor wishes us to know that appearances may be deceiving," Wolfe observed, carefully preserving the evidence with a handkerchief. "This is not random vandalism, but calculated psychological warfare, designed to demonstrate both capability and contempt for our security." Danny Marsh had grown increasingly agitated during our investigation, his fear palpable as he realized the implications. "She found me," he whispered. "Lydia knows I'm here. She's going to kill all of us." Wolfe fixed him with a stern look. "Nonsense. If immediate violence were intended, we would already be experiencing it. This is theater, Mr. Marsh, designed to induce panic and poor judgment. It will accomplish neither." Inspector Kramer arrived 20 minutes later with 2 plainclothes detectives, his expression suggesting he had been dragged from comfortable sleep to deal with problems he didn't fully comprehend. His initial irritation at being summoned dissolved quickly when he heard Marsh's full confession regarding the attempt on Judge Blackwood's life. The mention of a federal judge, poison, and a conspiracy, crossing state lines, captured his attention with the intensity of a man who recognized career-making potential when it appeared at his door. "You're telling me a federal judge gets poisoned in a private club, and instead of reporting it immediately, you conduct your own investigation," Kramer said, his voice carrying dangerous calm. "Now you've got a witness claiming someone broke into your office and evidence that may have been tampered with. Explain why I shouldn't arrest everyone in this room for obstruction of justice." Wolfe remained unperturbed by the threat, pointing out that Marsh had come voluntarily, that Judge Blackwood refused to acknowledge any crime, and that arresting the only witnesses capable of identifying the perpetrator would be counterproductive. After examining the bourbon bottle and the kitchen window, Kramer took custody of Danny Marsh, with promises of protective custody and detailed statements in the morning. Before departing, he grudgingly agreed that the break-in demonstrated escalation requiring immediate attention. Someone with professional skills got into your house without waking anyone, moved evidence, and left without disturbing anything else, he noted. That takes either exceptional training or inside knowledge of your routines. The morning brought additional complications when Kellner called at 9:30 in a state of barely controlled panic. "There's been another incident at the club," he reported breathlessly. "Julian Vane's private locker was broken into during the night. Someone left a threatening note inside, and he's demanding police involvement and my immediate resignation. The entire membership is in an uproar." The note, typed on club stationery, read, "Your turn is coming. Justice delayed is not justice denied." The same person who got to Blackwood can get to anyone. Wolfe listened to this development with his eyes closed, processing the information with methodical precision. "Interesting," he murmured. "Our opponent is creating chaos, multiplying targets and forcing reactions. This suggests increasing desperation rather than confidence. Tell Mr. Kellner we will arrive as planned for our meeting with Mrs. Corves, and that Mr. Vane should be invited to join us." Elena Corves arrived at the Brownstone precisely at 11 o'clock, accompanied by a lawyer named Arthur Sterling, who carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating opposition through legal threats. She wore a charcoal gray suit that managed to look both professional and vaguely menacing, and her initial approach was pure offense. "This harassment must stop," she declared before taking a seat. "My privacy has been violated, my reputation impugned, and my financial affairs investigated without cause. We are prepared to take immediate legal action." Wolfe regarded them with mild interest, as if watching a predictable theatrical performance. "Madame, we are here to discuss realities, not legalities. Specifically, the reality of attempted murder and your connection to it." When she denied involvement, citing her well-known animosity toward Judge Blackwood as insufficient evidence, Wolfe introduced the testimony of Danny Marsh. "Mr. Antonelli has provided detailed accounts of his employment by a woman fitting your description, who provided information, funds, and the lethal agent used in the attempt." The revelation of Marsh's confession visibly shook her composure. But she maintained her denial. "A criminal's word against mine. No court would accept such testimony." Wolfe nodded agreement, then mentioned the gloves. Mr. Antonelli noted that his employer wore gloves constantly, claiming a skin condition. "The person who entered this office last night left traces consistent with high-quality leather glove treatments, the same type you are wearing now." For the first time, genuine surprise crossed her features. "I've never been in this house before today. If someone entered your office, it was not me." The denial carried conviction, which created an interesting puzzle. If she hadn't moved the bottle, someone was attempting to frame her using details that pointed specifically in her direction. At that moment, Kellner called with explosive news. Police searching the club had discovered a vial of nicotine extract hidden in Julian Vane's office, along with a typed confession claiming responsibility for the attempt on Judge Blackwood. The timing was suspicious, the evidence too convenient. A man who hires professionals does not typically preserve murder weapons and confessions in his office, Wolfe observed dryly. This has the distinct aroma of manipulation executed with more enthusiasm than intelligence. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone was systematically framing suspects, first directing attention toward Elena Corves through the glove evidence, then toward Julian Vane through planted materials. The real orchestrator remained hidden, using the others as pawns in a more complex game than simple revenge. As I prepared to call Kramer with instructions to bring both the evidence and Vane to the brown stone, I realized we were approaching the moment when careful maneuvering would give way to direct confrontation. The puppet master was about to be forced into the open, and the next few hours would determine whether we exposed them or provided them with additional victims. The afternoon gathering in Wolfe's office resembled a tribunal more than a social call, with Julian Vane arriving under police escort and Elena Corvus maintaining her icy composure despite the morning's revelations. Inspector Kramer positioned himself near the door with 2 detectives, while Arthur Penhaligon took his customary chair with the air of a man attending theater he had not paid to see. Martin Kellner entered last, carrying himself with the careful control of someone who knew the performance was nearing its climax, but wasn't certain of his role in the final act. Wolfe surveyed the assembled company with the methodical attention of a botanist examining specimens that might prove either beneficial or poisonous. "We are gathered," he began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "because someone in this room attempted murder while simultaneously orchestrating an elaborate deception designed to implicate others. The sophistication of the crime contrasts sharply with the clumsiness of the cover-up, which suggests either remarkable arrogance or remarkable desperation." He turned first to Julian Vane, who sat rigid with the tension of a man expecting execution. "Mr. Vane, evidence was discovered in your office implicating you in Judge Blackwood's poisoning. A vial of nicotine extract and a typed confession conveniently preserved for police discovery. Yet this evidence is too obvious, too carelessly maintained for someone of your legal experience. A man who has practiced law for 20 years does not preserve murder weapons and confessions in unlocked desk drawers." Vane's relief was palpable but tempered by lingering fear. "Someone planted those items. I haven't used a typewriter in 15 years, and I've never seen that vial before in my life." Wolfe nodded acceptance of the point, then shifted his attention to Elena Corvus. "Mrs. Corvus, you were implicated through Mr. Antonelli's description of his employer, a woman matching your general appearance and mannerisms. Yet the description relied heavily on accessories and affectations rather than immutable physical characteristics. Gloves, accent, hairstyle, all easily adopted by someone with theatrical training." Her eyes narrowed with understanding. "You're suggesting someone studied me, then impersonated me to hire that man?" Wolfe inclined his head slightly. "Indeed. Someone with access to observe your habits, your schedule, your interactions with other members. Someone who could move freely within the club without attracting suspicion or comment." The implication settled over the room like a gathering storm. Wolfe reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small evidence bag containing what appeared to be a brass key. This morning, Inspector Kramer's investigation of the club's premises yielded this item, discovered taped beneath a desk in the administrative offices. It opens a storage locker at Grand Central Station, rented 3 months ago under the name Marcus Antonelli, paid for with cash. Kellner's face went pale, but he maintained his composure with visible effort. Wolfe continued relentlessly. The locker contained items of considerable interest: a wig matching Mrs. Corvus's hair color, high-quality leather gloves, lock-picking tools of professional grade, and theatrical makeup, including grease paint that matches residue found on the bourbon bottle moved in my office last night. The evidence was damning, but Wolfe was not finished. "Mr. Kellner, your background includes amateur theatrical work, does it not? Community theater, specifically roles requiring character makeup and voice work. You mentioned this during your initial employment interview with the club 15 years ago, though you have not pursued such activities recently." Kellner's voice, when he found it, was barely above a whisper. "That was years ago. A hobby, nothing more?" Wolfe's expression suggested he found the denial inadequate. "A hobby that provided you with skills essential to this deception. The ability to alter your appearance convincingly, to adopt mannerisms and speech patterns, to move in character without betraying your true identity." Inspector Kramer stepped forward, his notebook ready. "What's the motive, Wolfe? Why would Kellner poison a club member and frame others for it?" Wolfe leaned back in his chair, preparing to deliver the final revelation. "Financial desperation, Inspector. Mr. Kellner has been speculating in real estate investments that have failed catastrophically. He faces bankruptcy within 60 days unless he can secure substantial funds immediately." Saul Panzer entered from the front room, carrying a manila folder that he placed on Wolfe's desk. "The club maintains a comprehensive insurance policy," Wolfe explained, opening the folder, "including coverage for incidents that might force temporary or permanent closure. Poisoning of a member, particularly a federal judge, would trigger substantial payouts to cover lost revenue, legal expenses, and reputation damage. As manager, Mr. Kellner would be entitled to a significant portion of those funds as severance and compensation." The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Kellner had not merely attempted murder. He had orchestrated an insurance fraud scheme using attempted murder as the trigger. "The poisoning was carefully calibrated," Wolfe continued. "Enough nicotine to create a medical emergency, but not enough to ensure death. A sick judge generates insurance claims. A dead judge generates federal investigation that insurance companies cannot deflect." Kellner's composure finally cracked. "It wasn't supposed to be this complicated," he said, his voice hollow with defeat. "Blackwood was supposed to have a health scare. The club would close temporarily for safety review, insurance would pay out, and everyone would move on. I never intended to hurt anyone permanently. But when the initial plan succeeded too well, you needed scapegoats," Wolfe observed. "You created the Lydia persona to hire Mr. Antonelli, using your theatrical skills to impersonate Mrs. Corves. You planted evidence implicating Mr. Vane. You sent threatening letters to both, designed to establish their guilt while providing yourself with plausible deniability." Kramer signaled his detectives, who moved to place Kellner under arrest. As they read him his rights, the man who had served the dark lounge faithfully for 15 years stared at the floor with the expression of someone who had gambled everything on a single desperate play and lost. "The break-in here last night," Wolfe added as the handcuffs clicked into place, "was your final attempt to muddy the waters, to suggest that Mrs. Corves or her associates were escalating their activities. Unfortunately for you, desperation breeds carelessness, and carelessness leaves evidence. After the police departed with their prisoner, the office felt strangely empty despite the remaining occupants. Julian Vane and Elena Corves sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that the man who had mixed their drinks and guarded their secrets had been manipulating them all along. Arthur Penhaligon broke the silence with a dry chuckle. 15 years of faithful service, and it ends with handcuffs and insurance fraud. There's a lesson in there somewhere about the corrupting power of desperate men and easy money." Wolfe closed the evidence folder with finality. "The case is concluded. Judge Blackwood will recover fully, the dark lounge will survive its scandal, and justice has been served according to law, if not always according to desert." He looked around the room at the remaining suspects, now cleared of suspicion, but forever changed by their experience. "I trust this will serve as a reminder that private clubs, like all human institutions, are only as trustworthy as the individuals who manage them." As the others prepared to leave, Elena Corves paused at the door. "Mr. Wolfe, how did you know it was Kellner and not one of us?" Wolfe's answer was characteristically precise. "Because you all had obvious motives that pointed directly to yourselves, while he had a hidden motive that pointed away from himself. In my experience, the person who appears most helpful in solving a crime is often the person who committed it. Mr. Kellner brought us the case, guided our investigation, and provided access to evidence. He was too cooperative, too knowledgeable, and too eager to direct suspicion toward others." The afternoon sun was setting as the last of our visitors departed, leaving the brownstone in its accustomed quiet. Wolfe sat behind his desk, already reaching for the book he had abandoned the previous evening. "Archie," he said without looking up, Instruct Fritz that we will have lamb tonight, prepared with rosemary and his excellent wine sauce. After a day spent contemplating human folly, I require the consolation of superior cooking. I closed my notebook and headed for the kitchen, reflecting on the strange justice of the case. A man had attempted murder to commit insurance fraud, framed innocent people to cover his tracks, and ultimately destroyed himself through the very desperation that had driven him to crime in the first place. It was the kind of circular tragedy that made you wonder whether solving mysteries revealed truth or simply exposed the elaborate lies people told themselves to justify the unjustifiable. The dark lounge would reopen. Its members would return to their expensive liquor and private grievances, and somewhere in the city, another desperate person would begin planning another perfect crime that would prove perfectly imperfect. But for now, the brownstone was quiet. Dinner was being prepared, and Nero Wolfe had once again demonstrated that human nature, however complex its motivations, followed patterns that logic could unravel and justice could address. The morning after Kellner's arrest brought the kind of October sunshine that made Manhattan look almost innocent, which was probably nature's way of apologizing for the previous week's revelations about human nature and expensive bourbon. I had 2 items on my agenda: collecting our fee from the dark lounge and observing how an exclusive club handles the aftermath of having its manager arrested for attempted murder and insurance fraud. Wolfe had instructed me to be thorough in my observations, noting that institutions under stress often revealed their true character more clearly than individuals under interrogation. The dark lounge looked the same from the outside, but the atmosphere inside had changed, like milk left too long in the sun. The doorman's greeting was professionally correct, but carried the undertone of someone who had spent the night wondering whether his employment would survive the scandal. In the elevator, I noticed that someone had polished the mahogany panels to a mirror shine, as if excessive cleaning could somehow scrub away the stain of betrayal that now clung to the building's reputation. Leo Griggs met me in what had been Kellner's office, looking like a man who had inherited a throne and discovered it was made of dynamite. The frightened puppy expression had been replaced by something harder but more fragile, the look of someone who knew he was being watched by people with long memories and short patience. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, rising from behind a desk that still seemed too large for him, "I have your check ready. The board met in emergency session last night and voted to settle all outstanding obligations immediately." The check was generous, including a substantial bonus that suggested the board valued discretion as much as detection. "How are you holding up, Leo?" I asked, pocketing the envelope. "It's not every day your boss turns out to be running an insurance scam with a side order of attempted murder." His laugh was brittle as old paper. "The board kept me on, but I'm on probation. One more mistake and I'll be managing a hot dog cart in Central Park. They've also hired a security consultant to review all our procedures and a private investigator to conduct background checks on every employee going back 5 years. From the office, I made my way to the main bar, where the usual morning crowd was conspicuously absent. Marcus Tully was polishing glasses with the mechanical precision of a man trying to stay busy enough to avoid thinking. When he saw me, his expression tightened. "Come to see how the other half lives after the scandal breaks?" he asked. "Can't say I blame you. Place feels like a funeral parlor where they forgot to bring the body." I asked him about his cousin Julian Vane, and Tully's face went carefully neutral. "Haven't spoken to him since this whole mess started. Family loyalty only goes so far when it involves poison and federal judges." Julian Vane himself was holding court in a corner booth, nursing what looked like his 3rd cup of coffee and reading legal briefs with the focused intensity of a man trying to rebuild his reputation one case at a time. When I approached, he looked up with eyes that had acquired new lines overnight. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, his voice carrying the careful control of someone who had learned not to trust his own emotions. "I suppose I should thank you for clearing my name, though I find myself wondering how long it will take for people to forget I was ever suspected." In your profession, being suspected of something and beating the rap is practically a character reference, I told him. He managed a thin smile. Perhaps. But attempted murder is not the kind of publicity that attracts new clients. I've already had 2 corporate accounts express concerns about my association with the club. He folded his newspaper with precise movements. Kellner played us all for fools. 15 years of faithful service, and none of us saw what he was really capable of. Lena Korfs was in the smaller lounge, staring out the window at a city that had failed to deliver the justice she had originally sought. When she saw me, her composure remained intact, but something flickered behind her eyes. So the manager was the mastermind, she said without preamble. Not the grieving widow seeking revenge, not the desperate lawyer facing ruin, but the trusted employee with gambling debts and insurance knowledge. There's a lesson in there about the masks we wear. The lesson is that desperation makes people creative in dangerous ways, I replied. Kellner had access, opportunity, and just enough theatrical talent to make himself into whatever character the situation required. She nodded slowly, including making himself into me. That must have been quite a performance, convincing that criminal that I was hiring him to poison a federal judge. Her voice carried a note of grudging admiration. If he had put that much effort into legitimate business ventures, he might have solved his financial problems without resorting to attempted murder. Arthur Penhaligon was exactly where I expected to find him. In his usual corner of the smoking room, with a cigar and the morning paper spread before him like evidence in a trial. When I sat down across from him, he looked up with the expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation. So the club survives another scandal, he observed. The manager falls, the members scatter, and the lawyers circle like vultures. Civilization endures, after a fashion. Satisfied with how it turned out? I asked. He considered the question while blowing a perfect smoke ring toward the ceiling. Justice is an imperfect instrument, Mr. Goodwin. In this case, it struck the correct target, though not necessarily for the reasons I would have preferred. Kellner will face consequences for his actions, the innocent parties have been cleared, and the club will implement new security measures. That will have to suffice. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in the office examining a letter that had arrived by special messenger. His expression suggested the contents were not entirely welcome. Inspector Kramer informs me that Kellner's lawyer is attempting to negotiate a plea bargain, he said without looking up. Attempted manslaughter instead of attempted murder, white-collar rehabilitation facility instead of state prison, sealed records to protect the privacy of club members. The district attorney is apparently receptive to the proposal. I sat down at my desk and pulled out my notebook. Let me guess. The Dark Lounge's board of directors has been making phone calls to people with influence, suggesting that a quiet resolution would serve everyone's interests better than a public trial. Wolfe's grunt confirmed my suspicion. Indeed, they are concerned that extensive media coverage would damage both the club's reputation and of the privacy of members who had nothing to do with the crime. And what's your position on justice tempered by convenience? I asked. Wolfe set down the letter and leaned back in his chair. My position is that I was hired to identify the person who attempted to poison Judge Blackwood, not to determine the appropriate punishment for that crime. The perpetrator has been identified, the method has been exposed, and the innocent parties have been exonerated. How the legal system chooses to process that information is not my concern. The phone rang, interrupting our discussion. It was Judge Blackwood, calling from his chambers where he had apparently returned to work against his doctor's recommendations. Mr. Wolfe, his voice carried the authority of the federal bench, even over the telephone connection. I understand there are discussions about plea arrangements for Mr. Kellner. I wanted to thank you personally for your discretion in this matter and to assure you that whatever legal resolution is reached, your fee will be paid in full with appropriate bonuses. Wolfe's expression remained neutral. Judge Blackwood, my fee was established at the beginning of this investigation and has already been satisfied. As for discretion, I serve the truth, not the social register. If the facts of this case become public record, that is a consequence of Mr. Kellner's actions, not mine." After the call ended, Wolfe sat in silence for a long moment, then reached for the bourbon bottle that still occupied a corner of his desk. "Remove this," he instructed, his voice carrying distaste. "Its presence has become offensive. The contents should be disposed of, the bottle cleaned thoroughly, and both stored with the case materials. I do not wish to be reminded that excellent whiskey can be corrupted by human greed any more than I wish to be reminded that human institutions can be corrupted by the desire for respectability." I took the bottle to the kitchen where Fritz was preparing lunch with his usual meticulous attention to detail. As I poured the amber liquid down the drain, the smell of expensive bourbon filled the room, mingling with the aroma of whatever culinary masterpiece Fritz was creating. It seemed a fitting metaphor for the entire case. Quality wasted because someone thought they could cheat the system and profit from betrayal. Lunch was excellent, as always, but Wolfe ate with less than his usual enthusiasm. Afterward, as we settled in the office for coffee, he made one of his rare personal observations. "Archie, this case has reminded me why I prefer the company of orchids to that of most humans. Orchids may be temperamental, but they do not attempt insurance fraud or poison their caretakers when facing financial difficulties. On the other hand," I pointed out, "orchids don't pay our fees or provide us with interesting problems to solve. You'd be bored out of your mind if all you had to do was water plants and read books." Wolfe considered this while sipping his coffee. "Perhaps, but I would also sleep more soundly, knowing that my office had not been invaded by desperate men with theatrical training and homicidal intentions." The afternoon brought final confirmation that the case was truly closed. Kramer called to report that Kellner had accepted a plea agreement, guilty to attempted manslaughter and insurance fraud, 5 to 7 years in a minimum security facility, restitution to be paid from his remaining assets. The Dark Lounge would implement new security measures, hire additional staff, and contribute to a fund for victims of white-collar crime. Judge Blackwood would return to the bench with enhanced security and, presumably, a more cautious approach to private club dining. As evening approached and Fritz began preparations for dinner, I reflected on the strange justice of the case. A man had attempted murder to commit insurance fraud, framed innocent people to cover his tracks, and ultimately destroyed himself through the very desperation that had driven him to crime in the first place. It was the kind of circular tragedy that made you wonder whether solving mysteries revealed truth or simply exposed the elaborate lies people told themselves to justify the unjustifiable. The doorbell rang one final time at 6 o'clock, delivering a courier envelope from the Dark Lounge's board of directors. Inside was an additional check, larger than our original fee, accompanied by a polite note requesting that we destroy any records not directly related to the criminal investigation. Wolfe examined the check, then handed it to me for deposit. "File all records as usual, Archie. We do not destroy documentation to suit the convenience of wealthy men who confuse privacy with immunity. If they wish to purchase silence, they should hire public relations firms, not detectives." That evening, as Wolfe returned to his interrupted reading and Fritz served a dinner that restored faith in human civilization, the brownstone settled back into its accustomed rhythm. The Dark Lounge case was closed, filed under K for Kellner and B for betrayal, another reminder that human nature remained as predictable as it was disappointing. But in a city full of dark lounges and darker motives, someone had to keep the lights on, and for better or worse, that someone was us. A week after the Dark Lounge case filed itself under the category of problems solved but not forgotten, the brownstone had almost regained its normal equilibrium. Fritz had stopped checking the kitchen windows twice before retiring. The morning mail had returned to its usual collection of bills and botanical catalogues, and Wolfe had retreated into an orchid phase so intense that I began to suspect he was cultivating varieties specifically designed to restore his faith in living things that didn't attempt insurance fraud. The empty bourbon bottle sat in the evidence cabinet, clean and harmless, a reminder that even the finest things could be corrupted by human greed. The only lingering remnant of our recent adventure was Inspector Kramer, who arrived Thursday afternoon carrying an unlit cigar and the expression of a man who had eaten something that disagreed with his sense of justice. He settled into the red leather chair with the careful movements of someone who knew he was about to complain about things beyond his control, but felt compelled to complain anyway. "I still don't like how this ended," he announced without preamble. "Kellner gets a plea deal, Marsh disappears into witness protection, and the dark lounge goes back to serving overpriced drinks to people who think privacy is a constitutional right." Wolfe looked up from his book with the patience of a man who had expected this conversation. "Your dissatisfaction, Inspector, stems from the gap between justice as an ideal and justice as a practical mechanism. The machinery of law has processed this case according to its design. That the result does not satisfy your personal sense of proportion is regrettable, but irrelevant." Kramer shifted in his chair, working his cigar between his fingers. "What bothers me is that Kellner almost got away with it. If that Marsh character hadn't panicked and come to you, we might never have figured out the whole insurance angle." "Perhaps," Wolfe conceded. "But Mr. Kellner's fundamental error was not tactical, but psychological. He believed he could manipulate wealthy, powerful people indefinitely without consequences. Such arrogance invariably leads to carelessness, and carelessness leads to exposure. His downfall was inevitable. We merely accelerated the timeline." The doorbell interrupted our philosophical discussion, and I went to answer it, expecting another delivery or perhaps a potential client drawn by our recent publicity. Instead, I found a courier holding a wooden crate that looked expensive enough to contain crown jewels. The return address indicated it came from the insurance company that held the dark lounge's policy. Inside, nestled in custom foam, were 6 bottles of Pappy Van Winkle Family Reserve, each one worth more than most people's monthly rent. The accompanying card expressed the company's gratitude for preventing a multi-million-dollar payout and suggested these bottles represented a small token of their appreciation. Kramer whistled appreciatively when he saw the contents. "That's about $20,000 worth of bourbon right there. Crime fighting pays better than I thought." Wolfe's reaction was immediate and decisive. "Remove it," he commanded, his voice carrying the tone he usually reserved for discussions of lima beans or television. "I will not have that particular distillation in my house. Every bottle is a reminder of Mr. Kellner's corruption of something that should have been enjoyed in innocence." I stared at him. "Boss, this is liquid gold. People wait years to get one bottle of this stuff." His expression remained unmoved. "Then they may continue waiting. Send it to the Police Benevolent Fund, donate it to charity, or give it to Mr. Kramer for his retirement parties. I care not where it goes, provided it goes elsewhere." Kramer didn't need to be asked twice. He stood up with surprising agility for a man of his bulk and began examining the bottles with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "If you're serious about this, Wolfe, the boys at the precinct would be grateful. We've got Sergeant Purley's retirement dinner next week, and this would make it memorable." Wolfe waved dismissively. "Consider it a contribution to police morale, which is perpetually in need of fortification." After Kramer departed, carefully cradling his unexpected windfall, the office settled into its familiar quiet. I returned to my desk and looked at Wolfe, who had already resumed reading as if expensive bourbon appeared and disappeared from our office every day. "You know," I said, "that was either very generous or very wasteful, depending on your perspective." He didn't look up from his book. "It was necessary, Archie. Mr. Kellner's crime was not merely attempted murder or insurance fraud. It was the corruption of trust, the perversion of service into betrayal. I will not celebrate the resolution of such a case by consuming the fruits of his deception, however aged and refined they might be. Fair enough, I said, closing my notebook on the final entry of the dark lounge case. But I still think Fritz could have made something spectacular with that bourbon. Wolfe's smile was barely visible. Fritz has no need of corrupted ingredients to create excellence. His genius lies in transforming honest materials into transcendent experiences. That is a lesson Mr. Kellner never learned. That true satisfaction comes not from manipulating others, but from perfecting one's own craft. As evening approached and Fritz began preparations for dinner, I reflected on the strange justice of the case. A man had attempted murder to commit insurance fraud, framed innocent people to cover his tracks, and ultimately destroyed himself through the very desperation that had driven him to crime in the first place. The dark lounge would survive, its members would return to their expensive grievances, and somewhere in the city another desperate person would begin planning another perfect crime that would prove perfectly imperfect. But for now, the brownstone was quiet. Dinner was being prepared with ingredients that carried no history of betrayal. Nero Wolfe had once again demonstrated that human nature, however complex its motivations, followed patterns that logic could unravel and justice could address. The bourbon bottle sat empty in its cabinet, a reminder that even the finest things could be corrupted, but also that corruption, once exposed, lost its power to deceive. In the end, that was perhaps the most valuable lesson the dark lounge had taught us. The truth, like good bourbon, improved with patient attention and careful handling. 3 weeks after Inspector Kramer departed with his unexpected windfall, the dark lounge case achieved its final resolution through a series of calls and visits that demonstrated how institutions and individuals process the aftermath of betrayal. The first came from Judge Harrison Blackwood, whose voice carried the measured authority of someone accustomed to delivering verdicts, but now found himself in the unusual position of expressing gratitude to a private detective who had saved his life while exposing his poor judgment. "Mr. Wolfe," he said after the usual pleasantries, "Martin Kellner was sentenced this morning. 5 years minimum security, full restitution, permanent ban from employment in hospitality or financial services. I wanted to thank you personally for your discretion throughout this matter." Wolfe listened without enthusiasm, his expression suggesting he found institutional gratitude as tedious as institutional obstruction. "Judge Blackwood, justice was served despite your initial reluctance to acknowledge that a crime had occurred. Had you cooperated immediately rather than protecting reputation, Mr. Kellner might have been apprehended before he had opportunity to frame innocent parties and invade my home." The silence that followed suggested the judge was recalibrating his approach to expressing appreciation. After he hung up, I looked at Wolfe with curiosity. "You just lectured a federal judge about obstruction of justice. That's either brave or foolish." He closed his book with finality. "It is accurate. Judge Blackwood's desire to avoid scandal nearly allowed a guilty man to escape. That he now wishes to express gratitude for cleaning up his own mess does not alter the fundamental facts." 2 days later brought our most unexpected visitor, Elena Corves, arriving without announcement at 4 o'clock, dressed in a simple black coat and carrying herself with less of the icy composure that had characterized our previous encounters. When I showed her into the office, Wolfe regarded her with the careful attention of someone examining a puzzle piece that had finally revealed its proper place. "Mrs. Corves," he said, gesturing to the red leather chair. "I assume this is not a social call." She settled with movements that suggested careful control over emotions wanting to break free. "I came to apologize, Mr. Wolfe. When I joined the Dark Lounge 6 months ago, I had every intention of destroying Judge Blackwood's reputation, if not his life. I cultivated relationships, gathered information, and waited for the perfect opportunity to strike. Her hands twisted in her lap, the only visible sign of turmoil underneath. But I didn't poison him. When I heard about his collapse, my first reaction was satisfaction, followed immediately by disappointment that someone else had beaten me to it. Then came the realization that I had become exactly what my husband's crimes had made me. Someone consumed by revenge, willing to destroy others to satisfy my own sense of justice. Wolfe listened without interruption, his expression neutral. "And what has prompted this confession? Kellner has been sentenced, the case is closed, and your involvement has been determined coincidental rather than criminal." She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "Because you knew, didn't you? From the beginning, you suspected I was capable of exactly what Kellner did. The only difference was that he acted on his desperation while I merely contemplated mine." "I suspected many things," Wolfe replied carefully, "including the possibility that your presence represented a long-term strategy of revenge. However, suspicion is not evidence, and capability is not culpability. You did not poison Judge Blackwood, regardless of what you might have wished in darker moments." She stood, preparing to leave. "I've resigned my membership at the Dark Lounge. I'm moving to California, starting fresh where my husband's name carries no weight. I wanted you to know that your investigation did more than solve a crime. It showed me what I was becoming, and I didn't like the reflection." After she departed, the office felt peaceful, as if the final ghost of the case had been properly exorcised. I turned to Wolfe, who had returned to his book but hadn't started reading. That was unexpected. Confession from someone who didn't actually commit the crime. He looked up with satisfaction. Mrs. Corves possessed the intelligence to recognize that revenge, however justified it might seem, ultimately corrupts the avenger as thoroughly as it punishes the target. That recognition represents genuine wisdom, considerably rarer than mere cleverness. Fritz appeared, announcing that dinner would be ready in 30 minutes. As he retreated to the kitchen, Wolfe set down his book and delivered one of his pronouncements on human nature. "This case has reminded me of an essential truth about our profession, Archie. We solve mysteries not merely to punish the guilty, but to free the innocent, including those who are innocent of action but guilty of intention. Mrs. Corves sought absolution for crimes she contemplated but did not commit. That she recognized the distinction suggests there is hope for human nature, however faint." That evening's dinner was leg of lamb with rosemary, prepared by Fritz with the solemnity he brought to meals when he felt the household had narrowly escaped disaster. We ate in Wolfe's enforced silence, then returned to the office for coffee and final reflections on the case. The rain had started again, tapping against windows and emphasizing the warmth and security of the brownstone. "You know," I said, watching steam rise from my cup, "Kellner was a good actor. 15 years of playing the loyal servant makes you wonder how many other people are walking around wearing masks that fit so well you can't see the seams." Wolfe sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "We all wear masks, Archie. Civilization requires it. The distinction lies not in the wearing, but in the intent. Kellner's mask was worn not for politeness, but for predation." I filed the final notes, closed the folder, and placed it in the cabinet next to the empty bourbon bottle. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new clients, new mysteries requiring Wolfe's peculiar genius for unraveling human complexity. But tonight, we would enjoy superior cooking, good conversation, and the knowledge that justice, however imperfect, had been served according to the best traditions of detection and moral clarity. As I prepared to head upstairs, I paused by the evidence cabinet where the clean, empty bourbon bottle sat on its shelf, looking innocent again. Some things, I reflected, were better left sealed, even when empty. The dark lounge case was closed, its lessons learned, and the brownstone had returned to its accustomed rhythm of excellence, integrity, and the occasional perfect meal. The final resolution of the dark lounge case arrived not with dramatic revelation, but with the quiet satisfaction of watching loose ends weave themselves into an inevitable pattern. 3 days after my conversation with Wolfe about the donated bourbon, Saul Panzer called with information that transformed our understanding of Kellner's psychology from criminal desperation to something far more complex and disturbing. "I found the connection you were looking for," Saul reported, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. Martin Kellner's theatrical background. 18 years ago, he performed in a community theater production in Queens called The Servant's Revenge. He played a butler named Marcus, who frames his wealthy employers for crimes they didn't commit. The maid who helps him was named Lydia. I relayed this information to Wolfe, who received it with the calm satisfaction of someone whose theoretical framework had just received empirical confirmation. "Of course," he murmured, leaning back in his chair. "Mr. Kellner was not merely committing insurance fraud, Archie. He was directing a performance, casting himself as the lead in his own revenge fantasy. The names Danny Marsh and Lydia were not random selections, but signatures, references to his moment of theatrical glory when he was the star rather than the servant. The psychological implications were staggering. Kellner had spent 15 years watching wealthy members treat him as invisible furniture, absorbing their casual arrogance and quiet cruelties, until finally he decided to write himself a starring role in their destruction. The poisoning wasn't just about money. It was about turning their most precious symbol, that irreplaceable bourbon, into the instrument of their downfall. "That explains the grease paint," I said, remembering the theatrical makeup residue on our bourbon bottle, and the elaborate framing of Mrs. Corves and Mr. Vane. He wasn't trying to hide. He was trying to create drama, to ensure his masterpiece received the attention it deserved. Wolfe nodded slowly. "Indeed. Professional criminals seek invisibility. Mr. Kellner sought applause, even if the audience consisted only of himself and the detective clever enough to appreciate his artistry." The phone rang, interrupting our analysis. It was Inspector Kramer, calling to report that the Dark Lounge's board of directors had voted to dissolve the club permanently. "Too much scandal, too much bad publicity," he explained. "Turns out that when your manager tries to poison a federal judge and frame half your membership, it becomes difficult to maintain an atmosphere of exclusive privilege." "Who knew?" After hanging up, I looked at Wolfe with curiosity. "Think they'll learn anything from this experience, or just find a new place to drink overpriced liquor and complain about their wives?" Wolfe's expression suggested he found the question naive. "They will learn that exclusivity based on wealth rather than character inevitably attracts those who confuse the two. The Dark Lounge died not because of Mr. Kellner's crime, but because it had already become exactly what he believed it to be, a theater for the performance of privilege by people who had forgotten the difference between having money and deserving respect." Fritz appeared in the doorway, announcing that dinner was ready. As we walked to the dining room, I reflected on the strange justice of the case. A man had attempted murder to commit insurance fraud, destroyed an institution in the process, and ultimately revealed truths that needed revealing about the corruption of service, the perversion of trust, and the dangers of treating human beings as decorative objects rather than moral agents. The meal was Fritz's excellent roast duck with cherry sauce, accompanied by a wine that had been properly aged rather than artificially enhanced. As we ate in Wolfe's enforced silence, I thought about the empty bourbon bottle in our evidence cabinet, clean now but forever marked by its association with betrayal and desperate ambition. Some things, once corrupted, could never be restored to innocence, no matter how thoroughly they were cleansed. Over coffee, Wolfe delivered his final observation on the case. "This affair has reminded me of an essential truth about human nature, Archie. We are all servants of something. Duty, ambition, revenge, appetite. The distinction lies not in the service, but in the master we choose." Mr. Kellner served his resentment so faithfully that it ultimately consumed both him and the institution he was meant to protect. I raised my cup in acknowledgement. To choosing better masters, then, and to recognizing when service becomes slavery. Wolfe touched his cup to mine with the gravity of a man sealing a pact. Indeed. And to the recognition that true excellence, whether in detection or cooking, requires no corruption to achieve its effects. The rain had stopped, leaving the city temporarily washed and innocent. The dark lounge was closing forever, its members dispersing to other venues where they would hopefully learn that privilege without responsibility was not exclusivity, but isolation. The case was filed, the fee deposited, and the brownstone had survived another encounter with human nature at its most theatrical and destructive. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on Kellner's final performance. He had written himself a starring role, directed his own downfall, and ensured that his moment of revenge would be remembered long after his victims had moved on to other clubs and other complaints. In the end, perhaps that was all he had really wanted. To be seen, acknowledged, and remembered as something more than invisible help in an expensive suit. The brownstone was quiet, the bourbon was gone, and tomorrow would bring new problems requiring Wolfe's peculiar genius for unraveling human complexity. But tonight, we could rest knowing that justice, however imperfect and unexpected, had been served according to the best traditions of detection, integrity, and the occasional perfect meal prepared by a chef who understood that excellence required no deception to achieve its remarkable effects.